I am greatly honored to be the recipient of the 2025 Samuel Z. Westerfield Award, the highest recognition bestowed by the National Economic Association. In receiving this award, I feel privileged beyond measure to be in the company of an exceptional set of economists whose professional contributions are benchmarks for excellence and inspiration for countless other scholars. Indeed, I am in awe of the list of previous recipients, which includes a Nobel Prize winner, ambassadors and high-ranking government officials, Federal Reserve Board members, university presidents, foundation executives, and influential academic researchers and public policy advocates. Lastly, I'm proud to note that I have been blessed to co-author publications with 6 of the last 7 Westerfield Award recipients. Bernard Anderson, Margaret Sims is here today, William Darity, Samuel Myers, Cecilia Conrad, and James Stewart. All right, I will be forever thankful to have my name among this august list of recipients of the Samuel Z. Westerfield Award. I would like to take a few minutes to discuss African American intergenerational mobility. All right? There's a persistent multi-generational black-white gap in favorable socioeconomic outcomes. We examine these generational differences to find levers that will allow us to close the racial gaps. Theoretical models and empirical evidence show that intergenerational mobility is affected by dynastic family transfers, public policy, market conditions, institutions, technological change, and so forth. The evidence shows that African Americans have lower rates of upward mobility and higher rates of downward mobility than whites. Importantly, these racial differences in intergenerational mobility are not caused by differences in family values and behaviors. In his 2015 NEA presidential address, Trevon Logan made the case that, quote, qualitative empirical data is a missing element of African American economic history. Rather than supplementary, narrative evidence should be a primary source of empirical data in African American economic history, end quote. For about the last 30 years, I've gathered evidence on my family's intergenerational transition from enslavement to present social and economic circumstances. This research has provided me with qualitative evidence to investigate my maternal family's intergenerational mobility during 1877 to 1931. I would like to share with you results from that research. I chose the Rollins family, which is my maternal family, because it's so similar to other African American families of the period. They were enslaved in the Deep South, and many members remained there after emancipation. They had no formal education among emancipation. They achieved upward mobility during Reconstruction. They were willing to relocate for economic advancement. Their social capital consisted of membership in African American organizations. They lived in a majority black county in a nearly majority black state. There were many children and grandchildren, and the family's well-being was limited by the rise and consolidation of Jim Crow. I chose 1877 to 1931 because of its similarity to the contemporary conservative era in the U.S. Right. Focusing on the period between 1880 to 1910, Darity, Dietrich, and Gilkey show that African American male occupational status remains 62% lower than white male occupational status, even as differences in the characteristics explain 49% of the racial difference of the gap in 1880 and just 30% of the status difference in 1910. Similarly, African American male wages were 2/3 of the white male wage for 1981 to 2007. Both governments both periods had governments that were hostile to unions and workers' rights. There was massive European immigration was an important element of the first period, while massive African, Asian, Caribbean, and Mexican immigration are an important element of the second period. Government regulation and oversight of corporations were devalued in both eras. Jim Crow arose and was consolidated during 1877 to 1941, while there has been a growth in racism during 1981 to the present. So, some background. My family roots are in Tallahassee, Florida, but some members left there and went to Boston. So a little background on what was going on in those two cities. In 1870, blacks were 49% of Florida's population. Leon County, Florida, was an overwhelmingly black county during this period, with African Americans representing nearly 3/4 of the county's population in the year before the start of the Civil War. At the dawn of emancipation, Tallahassee was a small town with an agricultural economy. The 1860 population for all of Leon County was 12,343 people. Whites were about 26% of the population. Free blacks were about 0.5%. Enslaved Africans were about 74%. And blacks and mulattoes together were 90%, blacks were 90%, while mulattoes were about 10% of the enslaved population. From 1877 to the start of World War I, an average of 2.5 African Americans were lynched per week. Florida was one of the states leading in these lynchings. I think the ranking was Arkansas had 1.994 lynchings per week. Florida had 1.655. Mississippi had 1.15. So Florida had, on a per capita basis, had more lynchings than Mississippi. If you had more lynchings in Mississippi, you have a problem. My great-great-grandfather, Charles Rollins, served on a circuit court grand jury in 1871. We don't have information on the nature of the grand jury's investigation, but 4 days later he was in Jacksonville to testify in a federal investigation of Ku Klux Klan activities in Florida. Anti-black violence was a daily concern in Florida. The violence was intense in the more sparsely populated areas, but it was a major problem throughout the state. Regional and state officials had different attitudes toward hate crimes. Conservative whites, the Democrats then, supported the violence. It was instrumental to their political power. Moderate whites, Republicans, sometimes had their heads in the sand and other times said they were unable to protect black citizens. More liberal whites, who were also Republicans, were sometimes murdered along with blacks. Boston was a little different. Two Rollins family members left Tallahassee for Boston in 1880. They found that anti-black racism existed in Boston just as it did in Tallahassee. That said, the two cities were not the same. Right? From its founding in 1824 to May 27, 1865, Tallahassee was a city of enslavement. On the other hand, Boston was the home of many famous abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison. African Americans were 1.4% of Boston's population in 1870 and just 2.2% in 1920. The Rollins family was a member of the African American leadership of Tallahassee, which was a local elite without national prominence. There were few college-educated persons among Tallahassee's black elite. The Boston black elite included men and women of national and international prominence. For example, William Monroe Trotter helped set the national agenda for radical black equality. Tallahassee was a city with only a small fraction of immigrants. Boston was a city of immigrants with a great many Caribbean black immigrants. Boston had a high quality and racially integrated public school system along with outstanding universities. The Tallahassee public school system was racially segregated and just getting off the ground. Despite the differences, there was an important similarity. Most black residents in both cities labored at or near the bottom of the economic ladder. African Americans in Tallahassee were agricultural workers and domestics. African American workers in Boston were low-wage service workers, such as waiters, porters, elevator operators, and domestics. Southern migrants were 46% of Boston's black population in 1890, 53% in 1900, and 37% in 1930. Born in Florida with mulatto parents from Virginia, the Rollins brothers, the two members who left Tallahassee and went to Boston, were quite similar to other Southern migrants. The new arrivals to Boston, who came to Boston had a specific reason for bypassing the other seacoast cities. They probably had relatives already there or some other specific reason for choosing Boston. They were more urban, literate, mulatto, and upper South in origin than most Southern blacks. Okay. Oh, that's an equation. We'll go past that. I had to have one. I mean, I'm a labor guy. All right. Okay. So these are the ancestors. Enslavement has robbed us of many of the details of the lives of Thomas and Rachel Rollins. The first set of persons there, those would be my great-great-great-grandfather and great-great-great-grandmother. Right? They were enslaved, illiterate, unable to build community institutions or record individual and collective achievements, and unable to accumulate property. We do know that they were both born in Virginia, moved to Florida, but we are unable to uncover the towns where they were born, the names of their parents and siblings, their laboring activities or skills, which of their ancestors are European, the arrival and origins of their African ancestors, etc. For Rachel, we don't know the year of her birth or her passing, though we do know approximately when Thomas was born, about 1813, and he died sometime between 1869 and 1870, and he registered to vote in 1868. Those were the parents of Charles, who was great-great-grandfather, and Charles' wife was Susan McLean Rollins, right? Her birthday says July 1, 1835. But if you do a lot of black ancestral research, a lot of people would pick July 1. Why? Because it was near July 4th. Or some people pick December 25. It's an easy to remember date, but those dates are like shaky. The years are shaky. So July 1, 1835, that sounds good. That'll work. All right. Charles and Susan are married in 1853. And I put married in quotes because they were property. Property can't marry, right? I mean, you have to be a human to marry, and if you're enslaved, you're not human, you were property. Nevertheless, they formed a family in 1853. And they started having children between 1854 and 1860. This part in blue here is really interesting. Charles begins to hire himself out from his enslaver. When I ran across this, I thought this was bizarre. This is an enslaved man who has the freedom to go around to Tallahassee. He was a skilled worker. He hires himself out, and he pays rent on himself. Well, he's enslaved. He paid a lot of rent on himself. So it's like, that is peculiar, right? But it also tells you something about slavery. He's not enslaved because whites didn't want to be near or work with black people. He's not enslaved because he had bad families. He's not enslaved because he's lazy. He's not enslaved because he needs white direction. He's enslaved because it's profitable to somebody, right? So in any case, this wasn't like it wasn't unusual to have someone do this, but it wasn't regular either, right? I think it also helped that he was mulatto, but we come back to that. Between 1854 and 1860, the 5 children are born. And not only that, but in the 1850s, they're affiliated with this church, Bethlehem Church, which becomes Bethel Missionary Baptist Church today. Well, why is that unusual? This is a church that was formed before the end of slavery. Right? It still exists today. It's the oldest black church in the state of Florida. There were no independent black organizations before the end of slavery, but this church has a very peculiar history. All right. Now, at the end of enslavement, Charles and Susan become free. They're living in Tallahassee, and for 12 years we have Reconstruction, which is a short period to allow for black advancement. And the stuff in blue are kind of the economic events that happen. So in spring of 1868, the family rents 60 acres of farmland. Sharecropping basically had kind of 3 different groups. One group rented farmland. Another group didn't rent the land but actually paid a share of the crop to the owner of the farmland. The people renting paid a fixed amount for the land. And then the third group were paid wages. So the Rollins family rented these 60 acres of farmland where they paid a fixed wage. But shortly thereafter, in August of 1868, they obtained the first homestead, which was 5 acres. That property remains in the family today. Right? And Charles is a founding officer of the Florida Bethlehem Baptist Association in 1869. That organization remains in existence today with that same name. That organization becomes the foundation for the Florida General Baptist Convention. The Florida General Baptist Convention, a few years later, forms a college in the city of Live Oak, Florida. The leaders of that college are chased out of town, so they go to Jacksonville. So part of the college is in Jacksonville, part of it is in Live Oak. James Weldon Johnson, his brother Rosamond, and more well-known people involved with the college in Jacksonville. The college in Jacksonville moves to St. Augustine, and then they reunite with the college in Live Oak. And in 1960, they moved to Miami, Florida, where they're now known as Florida Memorial University. All right? Also, that organization, the Florida Bethlehem Baptist Association, was founded in 1869. As it becomes the model for the Florida General Baptist Convention, which becomes the model for the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, which markets itself today as the largest private black organization in the world, right? So that organization had a lot of important impact. Another thing is the family adds to this property on Old Bainbridge Road in 1873. They had some money, right? $1,200 in savings, which is 5 minutes? Okay, wow. All right, to get through that. So they're accumulating wealth, income, during Reconstruction. Even in this period, in the 1880s. Now, this is after the Reconstruction, because Florida's Jim Crow Constitution is 1885. They continue to accumulate. They accumulate land, additional land, the land in blue, and that land is still in the family. But if you look at the educational achievement, and these are the children, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? They one of them moves to Boston where he becomes a letter carrier. The other big achievement is child number 5 becomes a big dairy farm owner. But they don't really advance much beyond where their parents were. And if you look at the education of the grandchildren, right? So they're doing pretty good. So they basically, their parents had zero education, their grandparents had no education. And now you see they're starting to move up into middle school and some of them high school graduates, right? These are people born in the 1880s and 1890s. And so this is, although there was a niece who lived with the family, her children didn't quite go as far. So they're moving up a lot in education. They had a great start. They're willing to relocate, right? Child number 1 moves to Boston, so his children they stay in Boston. Child number 2 stays in Tallahassee, but one of their children goes from Tallahassee to Jacksonville to Pensacola and eventually settles in Tampa. So they're moving all over Florida. Child number 3 also goes to Boston, so none of those children leave Boston. With child number 4 died early. Child number 5, right? There's a lot of relocation from Tallahassee to Pennsylvania to New Jersey, from Tallahassee to Jacksonville, back to Tallahassee, moving from Tallahassee to Fort Myers, back to Tallahassee to New Jersey, right? So there's a big gap. There's a big increase in education. There's a lot of movement to opportunity. But this doesn't have much impact on occupational achievement. All right? They have, so most of the people are married. They have 2-parent families. They have achievement orientation. They have the human capital. They have all the connections, all the social capital. They get the educational required. They're willing to move. But if you look at these are the grandchildren of Charles and Susan, none of them except one, who's a farmer, he becomes a dairy farmer with 350 acres of land, is the only one that kind of matches his grandparents in achievement. Right? There are 2 professional musicians who are actually jazz musicians. They didn't make a lot of money, but they were jazz musicians. And there was a porter in Boston who ended up using his money to buy housing, right? The land is eventually redistributed to some of the grandchildren, so they're in farming just as their father was, right? And even if you go to the great-grandchildren, now these are people who were born in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920. They began to become professionals. Right? There's a social worker, there's electrical engineers, college graduates, person who's a teacher, a registered nurse, minister. All right? So now you begin to get auto mechanic at Grambling. So you begin to get people who are professionals, but these are the great grandchildren of Charles and Susan. So it takes about 3 or 4 generations for the family to catch up to where their great grandparents were. That's the impact of Jim Crow. It holds back economic development not for a few years, but for multiple generations. Now, I'm not sure where to put this in the story, but I think it matters. Right? Great-great-grandparents Thomas and Rachel were both mulatto. Charles and Susan were both mulatto. Their children tended to marry mulatto women, so these are children of Charles and Susan. Except one case with child 5, it's a social mulatto. This is a person who had limited mixed race, but whose father was born free and enslaved. You know, like if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, this particular person's father was born free, and a complicated story happens. He's 10 years old, he gets enslaved in 1850, right? They never worked in the field. I mean, they born free, didn't know how to read and write. They knew all the powerful white population, right? So I'm not quite sure where that story fits, but it fits in there somewhere. So what do we conclude from this? One, with the impact of Charles Rawlings' ability to hire himself out, right? That tells us something about the nature of racism. At the end of the day, it's about money, right? And not all these other things that people sometimes throw in there, right? Racial inequality may have instrumental motives as opposed to subjective taste and insufficient information. They knew exactly his productivity because he had to pay rent on himself, right? So, yeah, I never cared much for statistical discrimination, right? They built their own social capital, right? They built their institutions, which helped fight against racism. A rising tide may not lift all boats, not if you got something like Jim Crow into effect, wicked structural racism. Competition may create inequality of opportunity and inequality of outcomes, rather than creating a level playing field. The case for reparations includes not only enslavement, but also Jim Crow, right? Authoritarian policies have multi-generational impacts. Understanding capitalism, the unique elements of African American intergenerational mobility is necessary for an accurate understanding of the political economy of capitalism. I don't think you can really understand American capitalism without understanding the nature and the significance of African American struggle within this country. Right? Thank you.